Let us continue with our conference and let us start our last afternoon session. So, in our final discussion, final debate, titled Towards a European Citizenship Consciousness, we will be listening to Herman van Rompuy, who is online, and we will also be listening to Romano Prodi, former president of the European Commission. I can see both of them. Good afternoon. We will also be listening to Adrian Pabst, who is a Deputy Director at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, Victoria Martín Torre from the European Parliament, Julio Martínez, Professor of Moral Theology from the University Pontificia of Comillas, and Íñigo Méndez Vigo, who, among many other things, has been the former Minister of Education, Culture and Sports. We will also have our moderator, Paloma García Ovejero. First of all, thank you very much to the translators for their work and for the patience that they are having with all of us. Again, thank you very much to the translators. We are fully aware that we have to speak slowly. We'll try to do our best. I would also like to tell our audience, our listeners, that we have not received any questions so far. Please, I encourage you to send us your questions to the telephone number that you can find on the screen. Let us start with this round table. And let us listen to Mr. Van Rompuy. Good afternoon. Good afternoon also to Mr. Prodi. Today we will be trying to provide a response to a question which is a difficult one. I don't know whether we are going towards a conscience, towards this consciousness, or whether we are just having a mental state, whether we are individuals, whether we are citizens, if this is Europe or if this is something different. Victoria was mentioning Schumann when he referred to a state, to a European spirit. We are not talking about the geographical state, but a state of mind, a disposition of the mind. It was mentioned here the concept of religion as an option for the founding fathers of the European Union. This was not an option. The fathers and the mothers of the European Union never made any apology at all. And now we are at a state where the next founding father of Europe will be Putin or will be no one, and the stepfather would be Netanyahu. So let us try to reflect on this, and let us try to take the next generation on board, next generation who is witnessing a war so as to achieve peace, and a generation that does no longer feel citizenship of the European Union because nationalities are disappearing and because of the limits and the borders are very fuzzy. And please, I repeat, I encourage you to present your questions to us on the phone number that you've seen before on the screen. Let us now listen to our two speakers. Brussels was born in the Schumann Square. He was a prime minister. He was the one behind the first treaty. So he was the one who started up the phase of the oligarchy which is so much contested these days in Brussels. Thank you, Mr. Van Rompuy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Dear friends of the panel, especially Romano, good to see you again. Especially Íñigo, good to see you again, my predecessor as President of the College of Europe, and of course the other members, Victoria and others of the panel. And ladies and gentlemen, I will tackle the theme from a more philosophical perspective. And you will see after my introduction that this is a very special perspective, less political than you could expect from a former politician. So European citizenship takes on a different meaning today than it did a few decades ago, because the citizens themselves are no longer the same. We live in a different kind of homeland, a different Europe, and in a different world. And this in all spheres of personal and of societal life. A new type of human being has emerged, as it were. In fact, the world of my grandparents and my parents has little to do with that of today. It is the world of yesterday and the day before yesterday. So, citizenship is also different. The communities in which life is embedded, ranging from families, neighborhoods, workplaces, nation states, etc., are deeply scarred by individualization. This trend, the latter trend, is at the root of looser bonds between people. Bonded is sometimes experienced as bound. We belong less to something or to someone. And we find this trend at all levels of living together, including in the European framework. Alienation towards the EU is not so much greater than towards the national state. And the same applies to the democratic deficit. It exists at all levels of governance, this democratic deficit. So a renewal of just European democracy makes no sense. In general, we need to increase what we call the input legitimacy of political democracy by involving citizens more directly in the decision-making alongside the elected mandates. And we need to increase output legitimacy, thereby delivering policy results, I stress the word results, in the areas that matter to many citizens, such as purchasing power, irregular migration, climate, mental well-being, and others. Individualization and fragmentation also mean that a number of people tend to be less focused on the common good or the common interest, but much is viewed from their own interests. But caring for the common good starts with solidarity and togetherness in the family, in the neighborhood, and above all this. Charity begins at home. Solidarity begins at home. And these layers, these different layers of belonging, are under pressure. In the long run, there is no macro solidarity without micro solidarity. And there remains the hurdle of going from one small solidarity to people who do not belong to our family, to our clan, to our language group, to our country, etc. So solidarity with those who are different, who are even foreign. It also means living with people who are different in every way, such as in terms of religion or belief, race, sexual orientation, and others. And that kind of living together in itself is different from the earlier, rather homogeneous communities. So that living together requires from all of us an effort. It is not spontaneous, living with differences. So a comparison about the nature of our societies between what it was before and now must take this into account. We live in an other kind of society and we have other types of human beings. On top of this, the permanent crisis since the 2008 financial crisis. So we have had all kinds of crises, Euro crisis, refugee crisis, climate crisis, a war, an energy crisis, the COVID, climate disasters, and so on. So the permanent crisis in 2008 exacerbated fear, insecurity, distrust, despair. And individualization also means that people must and can make their own choices about their lives. One cannot and will not hide anymore behind any authority or tradition. We have to do it ourselves. That's in the trend of individualization. However, in a hyper-competitive, volatile economy, new dependencies have grown that are at odds with greater individual freedoms in personal life. In this complicated world, often the schemes of the past are no longer always so relevant. Dear friends, official Christian social views, as expressed in papal encyclicals, departed from a society based on social organizations and shared values, on social consultation as an organizing principle alongside the market and the government. We had social consultation, market, and government. Organizations in general framed people in concentric circles from the family to the nation, so that individuals became persons, interconnected. Admittedly, this did not prevent the so-called stable societies of the time from ending up in wars and even civil wars in which the other became an enemy. Anyway, today many organizations no longer have the appeal and the representativeness they once had. Today, the national, what we call makeability of a society, the national societal engineering has greatly diminished given the openness of our economies and their interdependence, given also the globalization of just about everything, the globalization of sports, music, culture, science, tourism, fashion, migration, climate change, etc., you name it. And I wish good luck to those who think they want to take back control of their own national future. Nostalgia to yesterday's world will solve nothing. However, none of this prevents a strong desire of many of our compatriots, of many people, a strong desire for stability, harmony, happiness, and togetherness. The discourse on this is often drowned out by polarization and distrust, especially through social media, which fuel ego-centeredness and grouping of like-minded people. There is certainly a continuing need for a message of solidarity, compassion, empathy, loyalty, truth. And the pandemic showed this well. Most people are good is the title of a recent bestseller in the Netherlands, in Flanders and beyond. There is a need for a stronger social and family capital. However, no one can impose it. And new forms of associational life and cooperation must be encouraged, where online meetings and gatherings can also play a role. They are building blocks in restoring the sense of the common good, which now includes the European common good. Dialogue and cooperation should be encouraged everywhere. Democracy is conversation. I have no other definition of democracy. Democracy is conversation. And conversation is an exercise in other-centeredness. At the heart of citizenship is precisely this value, other-centeredness. It's about much more than the sense of belonging. The former, other-centeredness, is the prerequisite to the latter, a sense of belonging. If one frenetically seeks identity, often a negative identity, I am different and better than others. If one frequently seeks identity, one risks falling into the mistakes of the past, such as nationalism or other forms of particularism. Nationalism, unfortunately, is on the rise in the Western world. Think of the political cultural divide in the United States and the also 50-50 split around Brexit. European citizenship has an additional handicap compared to other forms of belonging. The EU is just further away from people spatially. It's a fact of life. After all, despite digitalization, we remain flesh and blood people. We have to see, to touch each other. And the second handicap is that the EU is a relatively young idea compared to the nation states, although some of which are also a rather recent invention. I am referring to the 19th century. So all transcendent projects, transcending the ego, are struggling. It is therefore also explicable that the EU is increasingly becoming a union of necessity. I explain. A number of vital problems, such as defense and climate, can no longer be addressed other than at the European or at the international level. There is simply no alternative. The famous TINA, the Europe of necessity. And during the COVID time, also, with the restrictions on move, many citizens wondered why there was no European approach to the pandemic instead of the patchwork of national and regional measures. Of course, this is a negative motivation, but the negative motivation is also a motivation. The strongest pro-European sentiments come from candidate countries, such as these days in Georgia and Ukraine. Although an anti-Russian and anti-autocratic sentiment also plays a big role there. In addition to the union of values, I'm referring to the Ukrainians, they must lack or risk missing. So the EU is still attractive. We have a lot of candidate countries. Remember also that more than half of the British today are pro-European. No one can predict the future, especially not the future of the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Van Rompuy. The time is over. We can wait 2 more minutes if you want to conclude.
I finish.
Thank you.
The current crisis is also a moral crisis. Socio-economic factors such as inequalities play a big role in addition. On the latter aspect, there are new forms of injustice, such as the question of who bears the burden of climate policies, the treatment of refugees and irregular migrants, the huge concentration of wealth, the new monopolies on money and power that have arisen in the new technologies. A contemporary Christian social thinking integrates these new factors. The social issue is back, albeit under new forms. Redressing those injustices may bring less societal unease, less societal malaise, but more is needed to restore togetherness. It will be a combination of bottom-up and top-down on the road to societal reconstruction. Who will be the master builder? Question mark. We should be part of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Mr. Van Rompuy. Professore, benvenuto di nuovo. Romano Prodi, expresidente de la Comisión Europea, como saben todos nuestros oyentes.
Professor Romano Prodi, thank you very much for your presence here this afternoon. Professor Prodi broke all the limits many years ago, many generations ago. He was a relevant figure in China, in the United States, in Africa, in the Sahel. He was a relevant figure in the membership and in the enlargement of the European Union. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us this afternoon. Professor, you've got the floor.
To this very interesting meeting. Even more happy because I was speaking after Herman, and he has already, let's say, painted the picture that we have in front of us. Clearly a much more difficult picture that our fathers had when they founded Europe, you know. Remember that I have always in my mind Adenauer, De Gasperi, and Schumann. They were speaking German, Catholic, using the same language, all oppressed by the fascist Nazist period of history, with really forced participatory citizenship. And their task was fantastic, it was imaginative, but in some way, as Herman told, it was also easier because they three were so homogeneous in their mind. Now Europe is different, and look, let's say, work on Christian social thought, as is prescribed in our conversation, is much more difficult because the influence of Christianity is much lower. The let's say, influence of religion, I don't talk about Catholic only, but all the religious spirit is going down. A completely different society. Even Christianity is a majority, but it's not a totality as it was, almost a totality it was in old time. And so, look, I put all my attention to this fact that to build a European citizenship, we must do something together. We must make action, you know. When we make some strong proposal, of course, that must unite people, we have a positive reaction. My fear is when Europe sleeps. When Europe sleeps or try to let's say, defend the past only, we lose the possibility of putting people together, So Herman, he insisted on inequalities, migration. These are the problems that we have to tackle, to make proposals, because otherwise, if we simply try to make compromise or let's say thinking to the mediation, people will not like us. I used to say to my students or former students, as I think that Europe has been the best bread prepared by history. We, of course, we did something that nobody has never done in history. But this bread is half cooked and half not cooked, and we have to cook it, because otherwise it's not good, And to cook it is, first of all, solidarity. Clearly, when there is all the suspicion, then some notion or some social group will exploit Europe to have power, or let's say to overdo or to damage other people. You will never have solidarity. Solidarity must be based, first of all, on let's say, an effort to go in the direction of social justice. This is, I think, the first goal of Europe, and not easy, I repeat, because clearly there are so many differences. We have to live with the difference, but also to give the idea that there is a common direction. Of course, we have to live and respect difference. Not easy, in the sense that with enlargement, Europe, the progressive enlargement, Europe has become, of course, more different, But we have a great advantage that we did not impose the enlargement. We exported democracy. And nobody in the world exported democracy, because you can export democracy only through democracy. And so I correct myself. We did not export democracy. We answered to let's say, to a demand to import democracy from new countries and new people. And we have given a proper answer, Now we have to improve our staying together. And so we cannot go on with Europe working with the veto rights in which anybody had the power to stop a common street, a common road. And when this happens, of course, you give the message that is not of a common citizenship. You have the message that everybody blackmails everybody else. And this is what is almost daily happening. And to avoid blackmails, we make compromise. And so we don't give the idea that we go in the direction of a common citizenship. We go in the direction of compromise only. And this is really a second problem that we have. The third is, look, Europe we understand, and our citizens understand, that we cannot be a world leading power, but that we can be really the peacekeeper of the world of mediation. The world of mediation. I do remember that when we have given this message, the Chinese and the Americans respected us. And I do remember that when we were building the euro, the Chinese president asked us and promised to have as many euro, as many dollars in the reserves, because if there was a euro side by side to the dollar, there would be place also for the renminbi. Translated in politics, the idea was, look, we are two big powers, but Europe clearly can mediate, can be respected, can be, and this is our role. But we must be united, and we have never been united in the last years in the foreign policy. Think to Iraqi war, think to Libya, think to Afghanistan, and so I do think that solidarity, let's say the goal of our meeting here of participation must be based on some basic common principle, also and mainly religious or historical, but some clearly common action in order to make progress, to give the idea to people that we step by step advance in our mission, and third, to have a role in the global world described by Herman, that is really global, but in which we are being marginalized, and we are marginalized step by step. So this is a clear, this is a compromise that we have done between spiritual and intellectual goals and practical action to implement this and to give the message to the world that together we count, we are important, And look, clearly, you mentioned Herman, Brexit, and so on, but I do think that after Brexit, nobody will abandon Europe. Everybody will understand that you can be also United Kingdom, you can think that you are the preferred son of the United States, you can think everything, but alone, you are alone. And if you want to perform your mission in the world, starting from common principle, you must have a common policy. I ended my 15 minutes and I robbed 1 minute more, and so I stop it and I am anxious to assist to the discussion.
Gracias, profesor.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Dos lecciones.
2 master lessons. That's been a gift. Thank you both. And thank you for staying with us. Solidarity starts at home. Solidarity is an effort. Here we don't have any questions, but we still have time. So to give the possibility to the audience. So we have the Parliament, MEP, Moral, the think tank. And I think that we can continue along a more than interesting path about the consciousness of European citizens, because that presupposes a culture of community. Victoria Martínez de la Torre knows a lot about it. And of community versus union. From Maastricht, we have lost the word communication. So are we still capable of feeling like a community? Yes, I think that maybe nowadays
it's more difficult. And maybe one of the reasons is that before we used to refer to European communities, and the word community already has a certain burden in terms of the kind of relationships that we want to build in this association of countries and people that we call European Union nowadays. I believe that this concept of community is very useful, not only to understand our past and where we come from, but also as a guide to know what we want from now on. I believe that in one of the previous roundtables, it was mentioned that maybe before it was easier because there were only 6 countries and they were more homogeneous. But I think it's also true that each generation needs to decide what they want to do with this project. And that's why it's a jump or a leap into the void, because our founding fathers, when Robert Schuman read the Schuman Statement, in which he proposed the creation of this community of coal and steel, in the long term, he proposed a federation. But what counted wasn't the final destination, but the path, as we were mentioning this morning. This is a project that it's an ongoing project, and the community gave us a hint of how we can go forward towards that final destination that could be a federation. And that's where Robert Schuman says that we need to be building a community so that we can develop that sense of belonging. And that can only be made thanks to a de facto solidarity. And I believe that what Mr. Van Rompuy said reflects very well this vision of community. Because with the difference of the state that usually refers to a social contract in which each individual born free renounces to a little bit of freedom because he gains certain advantages from living in society, or he has some rights and duties, the vision of a community refers to a person who is born, but is born defenseless and dependent, a person that depends from a community that, first of all, is a family in order to fully develop his personality. And we can see there how from the family we can have other communities that can be the neighborhood, the village, can be the town, the city, that can be the state. And we could think that there is a European community as well and a world community. And at each level, we can develop a certain kind of solidarity. And it's true that if we don't start by what's closest to us, if we're not aware of the fact that in order to develop our personality, we need this community that we are responsible for as well, it will be difficult for us to go forward in the construction of a common political project. And I believe that this is the vision that Robert Schuman proposed in his statement. We need to create these community links little by little so that we might get to the point in which we build a federation. Yes, Julio, go ahead. Microphone, please. No. I really feel that I'm privileged to be able to listen to the speeches by Mr. Van Rompuy and Mr. Prodi, and I really relate to what Victoria was saying. Mr. Van Rompuy talked about people. And that's where we understand community, because, of course, people are beings according to their relationship with one another. And being a person cannot be philosophically or theologically understood from self-sufficiency or from mere individualism. But Mr. Prodi talked about a common project, the fact that we need a common project that must boost us or encourage us to build maybe imperfect projects. And I believe that's where the key of community cannot scare us, because sometimes the key of community seems that we are creating a sort of cult, when the sense of person-centric community is capable of crossing borders so that we can see in other people who do not belong to our community dignified people. So people that we can relate to and people that we can help in solidarity. Adrian, I wonder if this sense of community or belonging has derived in union, and from your British perspective, from your position as professor at the Kent University, among other things, who are citizens at European institutions and vice versa?
For inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I think I'd want to start with, just a few paradoxes, because I think they highlight something quite interesting. One is that, English is becoming really the main language, not just of officialdom, but of, Europe and its citizens, even as, Britain has exited the EU. So we live in this strange situation where actually the one language that increasingly binds people together across Europe is English. And of course, I would want there, to be more people to learn all the other languages, but that's also a reality we can't ignore. And then the other paradox I think that we should consider is that, yes, in a increasingly secularized Europe, there is this question of where faith in general and Christianity in particular fit in. But I think one can also make the point that a purely secular world is not ultimately sustainable. We've seen this in the most extreme cases with state-imposed atheism in the Soviet Union and in China. And you always see religious revival in almost any society in the world. And I suspect we're seeing something similar in Europe with the presence of other faiths, very vibrant Muslim communities, but also smaller Jewish communities and others. And I think there is some intellectual, if not necessarily numerical, revival of Christianity. It's in many ways far more present in the public debate now than perhaps 30, 40 years ago. And I think it's this paradox that faith can help us save modernity, because faith reminds us of the transcendent outlook of humanity, the fact that we are not, as has already been mentioned by a number of speakers, we are not self-sufficient. We are not purely immanent. Rampant individualism in the end destroys the individual, destroys the person, because there is no basis any longer for being human. It robs us of the things that make us human, like agency, creativity, common endeavor, and other things. So given all of this, I think we are in the situation where a Europe that does exist in cultural and social terms can help us bind people together at all levels, local, regional, national, and international. Yet that's not the Europe that is in the ascendancy. The Europe that's in the ascendancy, I think, and has been since really the Treaty of Maastricht and the creation of the Union, is a Europe of market and states. It's not a Europe of peoples and nations. And so the question is, how can we reform, renew the Europe of nations and peoples so that markets and states, crucially important institutions for all sorts of things, can once again serve peoples and nations better than they have done? And I think that's really the challenge in front of us. And citizenship is precisely that. It's a way of living together in society amongst all the differences that we encounter that have already been mentioned. But let's not forget that citizen is not only a matter of individual rights. That citizenship, crucially, is a question of duties. The duties I have towards myself, but crucially towards others. Towards, of course, my family and my neighbors and people in my locality, but also towards all in the same polity. And I think what we've lost sight of too much within the member states and at the EU level is this notion of duties. What are the mutual obligations that we have? And yes, there are examples of solidarity, of course, in Europe. Of course, there are important examples of subsidiarity, but too often Solidarity has been a one-size-fits-all model. We've sort of imposed one model of solidarity on all member states or all people. And subsidiarity has often meant that powers have flown upwards. And yes, for some things, we need decisions taken at EU level, financial regulation, climate change, reconstruction after COVID, Ukraine help, and all manner of things. There are good examples of where power needs to be exercised at the high level, but there are plenty of examples where power should be located at lower levels, in line with the dignity of the person. And I'll finish on this. That's the core principle, that what makes Christianity a different kind of universalism that can also help us stand up to the very dangerous particularisms of ethno-nationalism, of fundamentalist faith, and so on. What makes Christianity a different universalism is the fact that it's all about the dignity of the person in relation to other persons. And if we lose sight of that, then frankly, we have no hope of giving citizenship a proper meaning, a proper purpose. Citizenship is too devalued at national and European levels. It needs to again be focused on the person, embedded in relationships and institutions. And that's where I think there needs to be a radical reform of some of the institutions. I'm happy to talk about that later, but I think let me leave it here for the moment.
Thank you, Adrian. Íñigo.
Thank you, Adrian. Íñigo, let's go to the matter of consciousness, the founding fathers and the founding mothers, because there are founding mothers. They started from a European consciousness based on nationality and reconstruction after world wars. Nowadays, the glue that defines this consciousness is, as Adrian was pointing out, a concatenation of crises, including the pre-war scenario in which we are now. Does it make sense to speak of a European consciousness in the future? You lived in Brussels for 30 years, or coming back and forth and overseeing certain projects. So, well, of course it does make sense. One of the founding fathers in Europe said that Europe wouldn't be a reality if it didn't exist in people's consciousness. So I don't think that Europe is characterized by a concatenation of crisis, but a response to this crisis. Victoria was talking about the 9th of May. We always talk about the Schuman Declaration, but some years ago I proposed that instead of celebrating the 9th of May, we should make an intellectual exercise to celebrate the non-9th of May, to think about how our life would be without Europe. Because I'm going to use a phrase, a sentence that Alberto Navarro, my predecessor, liked a lot. Europe, for us Europeans, is like the air we breathe. Every morning we wake up, you wake up. Is there anyone who doesn't like my expression? Is that we're hearing this? I'm sorry. I really hope it's because I have way too much hair and that's why the microphone, it's moving. Okay, shall I use this one alone then? I was saying that as we solve the issue here, I don't know whether Julio, who has devoted his life and a book to citizenship and religion, might want to give an answer to my question. Done? No, sorry. I was saying that, to wrap up, that we should think about how our life would be without Europe, because us Europeans, and here we have two great Europeanists, as Van Rompuy and Romano Prodi, and Robert Piquet used to say it as well, we are European without being aware of the fact that we are European, because the EU is so present in our life that we don't really grasp the idea of what it means. And if Europe did not exist, we would realize how important it is, for example. I have a house in the Basque Country, and when my daughter was very young, we used to cross to France, and my daughter couldn't understand why we went to to the Spanish beach and not to the French one. He said, but the French beach is much better. But I said, here in the bridge of Santiago, there used to be a border. And in a border, there was a station by the civil guard or the police, and you had to go with your passport and you had to change currency, and your Spanish car insurance didn't work in France. And that's why we stayed and we went to the Spanish beach. And my daughter, who's now 23, she didn't experience that. She's European without really knowing she is. She takes for granted that it's always been this way. And I think that the effort that we need to make to really go forward is to explain Europe. Here, Herman and Romano said that very often governments blame Europe for their troubles. But governments manage Europe in the Council and in the European Parliament that we will elect in the coming weeks. So we need to blame those that make decisions, and government and Parliament and the press, of course, right? Because we don't report about it now. So that's what you say, and I'm not going to contradict you. Yes, I do say so. But I won't be blaming journalists, but the editors that are always thinking about their national issues at European level. So, the Migration Pact, we have a debate about access to abortion as a fundamental right, with capital letters. The voices that ask for a European Defence Fund, and in addition, the extension of the EU to more than 30 states from the point of view of the church social doctrine. Do you think that the social doctrine is still the pillar that gives foundation to these decisions, even if we're not believers or we don't consider ourselves religion? Do you think that we, the religious, do we think that we are still thinking about common good when we're thinking about this integration process? Well, we need to focus on those 4 values that are dignity as a key foundation. It's a transcendent value, as Pope Francis has stated repeatedly at European level. And we talked about subsidiarity, solidarity, and common good. I would keep those key 4 values. And here, the issue to my mind is that Europe has these values, but somehow what happens when confronted with crises, that are crises that take place in member countries, that apply changes in the world, for example, technological revolution, particularly the digital revolution, but not only that revolution. So before this crisis, Europe itself enters a crisis mode. And it does because it looks down on the foundations that feed and sustain those values. So each one of these topics that you've mentioned that are so important per se need to be analyzed. For example, it's not the same to talk about the terrible Russian aggression, to think that we need to defend ourselves. And I wouldn't oppose that to environmentalism. No, it's actually, it's a more of a budgetary issue. What I mean is that if we talk about turning abortion into a constitutional right that comes from France, but it's something that wants to be taken at European level, we don't know how to respond to the great challenge of migration and to leave behind the shame of the fact that the Mediterranean has become the biggest cemetery in the world. All of these important challenges need to be analyzed with the corresponding nuances.
However, if we focus on abortion, we can see that this is a very serious question, because just as the former speaker was saying, unless we are able to focus human dignity as the central point, we convert or we turn rights into weapons, and we lose the opportunity to transform liberty into sufficient autonomy. So, what has happened? Since abortion has become a constitutional right, we are putting life at a secondary stage, in a secondary position. Yes, but Julio, the Charter on the Fundamental Rights allows us or says that unanimity is required. So, of course, I do not agree with that, but this will never happen. What you're saying will never happen. I think that a reform of the treaties will allow for the inclusion of abortion as a European right. And also, it is important to mention that Europe does not need to do everything. Europe should only be in charge of those competences that have been previously conferred to it. And the family law is a case in point. Yeah, but 2/3 of the European members voted in favor of Europe taking responsibility for that issue. Yes, but all the decisions taken in that regard will not have any legal repercussions. So let us not confuse people saying that Europe will allow for abortion or will make abortion into a constitutional European right. Yes, I do agree that 27 agreement from the 27 countries is impossible. But there might be a sort of agreement, so they are just running away from facing current challenges. And so we make use of autonomous and subjective rights as a way of saying, well, look, this is Europe taking part here. And I think that if this is the Europe of the future, we are going through the wrong pathway. And after following these speeches from Van Rompuy and Mr. Prodi, we can see that this is true. I would like to say something in relation to what Íñigo has just said, that Europe is just the air we breathe every day, and also because it is an open project. It actually depends on us. It's been the manifesto from Spinelli, previous manifests and documents. But at the end of the day, it was the project of the communities that was successful, because it was based on a vision, on a clear vision. And I think it depends on us. The responsibility falls on us, on citizens. I am not a politician. I am a citizen. I am a Christian citizen. And as such, I would like to contribute to define what we should do with Europe, what path should we define for Europe. And this idea is contained in the original idea of Schuman. Schuman defended the philosophy of action, progress that does not happen from a vacuum. Progress happens because there is a pushing coming from a group of people in a specific direction. So we citizens should feel responsible for the European project. So maybe this is what we are lacking. We lack that idea, that conviction that Europe is not shaping its own, that Europe is shaped thanks to the participation, to the active participation of citizens. Sometimes we talk about large policies and maybe they do not fall within the competencies of the European Union. And sometimes we miss the perspective that sometimes Europe can be actually shaped and built on the borders. Humans proposed that borders should be just separation walls in contact points. So in that regard, I believe that citizens that really feel Europeans are the ones that take part in cross-border projects. For instance, I was very happy to know about a collaboration project between two different universities, Innsbruck and Trento, two universities that collaborate together, countries that have had different historical borders and that nowadays are collaborating with the idea of getting to know each other better and with the ultimate goal of resolving problems that affect their locals and their regions from a cross-border perspective. So in that regard, I think we can have and we should have a creative viewpoint of Europe. The original project was created as a Pacific Revolution, as a sui generis project, and myself, in my capacity as a responsible citizen of the European Union, I would like to know which projects I can take part. Being a European citizen is not only a question of voting every 4 years. Maybe my engagement can include the daily participation in many actions and activities, daily activities that little by little constitute and shape an identity, a European identity.
Every few years, and otherwise, sort of waiting for elected representatives then to account for their actions is just not enough. And in fact, the democratic deficit, I think, as was mentioned by Herman van Rompuy, always exists at all levels, because you can never perfectly represent, all your citizens, right? Because there's majorities and minorities, and they can differ according to issues. So the key thing is not so much the democratic deficit, which we have to acknowledge as a reality. It's to try and think, how can we build more representative government at all levels, local, regional, national, and yes, at the EU level too. And then how can we supplement representation through two other things: participation, which we've of course talked about a lot today, citizens participating. I don't think only as individuals, they also have to be allowed to participate as groups, as communities. And that then brings in the third dimension besides representation and participation. That third dimension is association. That actually human beings, more likely than just acting as individuals, really often act more like citizens as groups, right? And associations, intermediary institutions, trade unions, professional associations, faith communities, those institutions have to be properly brought into politics at all levels, whether local or regional or national or indeed the EU level. And I don't think that's happening enough. We're still working with very old binaries of either the individual or the collective. It's either my individual rights or some collective utility. But the fact is, there is a key difference between the common good as we understand it, both in the Christian sense, but also in, I think, a genuinely universal sense that other faiths and other perspectives can understand on the one hand, and the general interest on the other hand. Rousseau's definition of general interest is completely at odds and incompatible with the common good. The common good is the flourishing of all, right, through the reconciliation of estranged interests. So you're constantly negotiating, you're constantly trying to balance interests, right, between labor and capital, between the urban and the rural, between the old and the young, between the north and the south, and the east and the west, all of the distinctions we can think of. And the strength of the early Europe after World War II was precisely to put the focus on that, on reciprocity between different interests, right? It wasn't all about services back then. It was about industry and agriculture as well. It wasn't all about the big countries. It was also about the small ones. There was a sort of sense of lived, embodied reciprocity, which I think is an absolutely vital thing to preserve, because only then can you have meaningful solidarity and subsidiarity. So how do we recover this? I think we need to reconnect a lot of the European institutions closer to where people are. That means, for instance, thinking of much closer ties between the European Parliament on the one hand and all the national parliaments on the other hand. The European Parliament is a great institution, but I think as Larry Siedentop, who is one of the most pro-European thinkers in Britain, now in his mid-90s, has been saying for 40 years, the European Parliament, in some sense, was directly elected a bit too early. It needed to be linked up to national parliaments in some sense. That's one reform. I still believe that the Commission is an incredibly important institution, but should it be the only institution that can initiate law? Should it not be the case that the Commission, in the end, is really a European civil service, that should provide advice and important input, but should let elected politicians actually make decisions, including about what projects, what bills go to the Parliament. And then the third thing is, how can you reconcile the national governments with the Council in a way that might work better? So, for instance, could we think of a European executive that actually has nationally elected ministers who are in some sense on secondment, like for 2 or 4 years, serving in that executive so that it remains anchored in national politics, but also has a clear European mandate? These are just some ideas. I'm not suggesting that it can be adopted easily, that there's going to be consensus tomorrow. But unless we re-embed all political institutions in the communities and localities and associations that make up Europe, unless we re-embed politics where people is, we are always going to be facing the struggle between a remote technocracy at one end and some very, very dangerous populists at the other end. And it's a dynamic which I'm afraid the technocrats will not win. Politically speaking, the force is not with technocracy. Politically speaking, the force is sadly with populism. So we need to offer an alternative to both. Technocratic advice will always remain important. Michael Gove said something horrible during Brexit, which is that, we had enough of experts. Of course we need good experts. But I think the lesson of Brexit is that when national governments don't do the reforms, and when Europe doesn't seem to be recognizing that reforms are necessary and doesn't seem to be on the side of the people may vote against it. And whilst there may not be another member state soon that might leave, the wave of anti-EU populism is only gaining ground. So if we want to stop that populism, that ethno-nationalism from succeeding, we need to reform European politics rather more than just, things at the margin. The Lisbon Treaty wasn't a constitutional treaty, but did we learn all the lessons of the constitutional treaty and its rejection by 2 founding members? Not Britain, not someone else, France and the Netherlands. Did we really listen to all the citizens' concerns when those votes happened? I'm not so sure.
He oído por ahí algo.
Una mala noticia, Adrian. El Tratado Constitucional está en vigor y se llama Tratado de Lisboa. O sea que sacrificamos la forma para mantener el fondo, pero está en vigor.
I do not agree with Adrian's position. I don't think that the communities or that the past was better than the present. No, there were lots of blocks and there were lots of hindrances and lots of obstacles, and pessimism was present at the 70s and at the 60s at the time of the European Community of Coal and Steel. I don't therefore agree with that. I think that we need to work together on some issues because the union will make us stronger, and these competencies are transferred to the treaties. But the Commission proposes, and it is the Parliament that really takes decisions. And as for national parliaments, they actually do not have any role to play in the European institutions. If they were to take place, we would be destroying or ruining, so to speak, the institutional procedures in general. We created, however, some mechanisms at the time so as to create a fundamental role for national parliaments, but actually before the actual legal proceedings started. What was the result, however? In order to avoid the Commission blocking the subsidiarity principle, we came up with this procedure. However, we saw that this was not the case because the national parliaments can use the procedure of yellow card or red card and can block any legal initiative when there is a lack of legal basis. And what happened was that what we saw for 15 years is that those procedures were never implemented. It was never the case that the opportunity to apply them happened. And therefore, I believe that it is the Commission that should launch all the initiatives, and that is in line with the ideas of Schuman and Monet. And so national governments are not the ones to decide the national or the European common interests, because the commissions are not a secretariat. Of course not. Members of the commissioners are politicians. They are not just civil servants. They stand for elections. They are first elected and then they are elected, re-elected again, or sanctioned at the College of Commissioners. So just seeing them as civil servants is just a too technocratic viewpoint, so I do not agree. I've got a very good piece of news for you. We've got two questions. The extension of the European Union will create a stronger union? That's the question. Who would like to answer? As I said, the project is an ongoing project. So since we need to take decisions together, the process is an open process that should be accompanied by the corresponding reforms and amendments, and creating the results, whether the result will be a stronger Europe or not. Actually, I don't have the answer considering specifically the present geopolitical context. I think we should not jump ahead in our conclusions. We have a common project these days, and if we can see that the countries or the members wishing to become members of the European Union do share our common project, from the basis of the common good. And in the words of Pope Francis, he refers to an etymology which is, in my view, very important. The citizen equals the common good. And the common good is not an abstract horizon. The common good contains in its horizon hope, because when the dignity of the person is taken into consideration by including the personal interests, we can create little by little in a composite manner the common good. So if we have the right rules and the right procedures in place, communities will prosper. However, we should not think that communities might clash in themselves. The problem is that when there is no democracy, for instance, for Ukraine becoming part of the European Union would be a good option. It is good for the Ukrainians and it is good for Europeans. Why? Because we Europeans are not closed to extending our membership, because we share with Ukrainians values, their values, and in that manner we from Europe can defend their rights. So the enlargement of the European Union is not, to my view, the main question, the main challenge that we have ahead. My concerns lie in the fact that we are suppressing values and we are in an urgent need more than ever before of those values. Of course, those values were fundamental and essential at the time of the creation of the European Union. However, now we are facing an enormous war in Europe. And there are some people who are saying, well, the Ukraine-Europe is not a European war. It is on European territory. It might not be a European war, but it is a war on European territory. This is why I am emphasizing the role of values and the dismissal of those values. We are attacking our own values and we are risking those values. We might lose those values, and religions are aimed at obtaining the good, are aimed at reaching the good. And religions are pre-political foundings and foundations to together construct the common good. We've got two questions, and I would like to invite Mr. Van Rompuy and Mr. Prodi maybe to answer some of the questions. Principles and values are considered to be essential values so as to guarantee European democracy. But aren't we in a situation where the role of Europe in geopolitics have lost part of its weight? Would you like to answer to this question, maybe, Professor Prodi?
The problem of values is, of course, complicated because we had in the recent times some country that has not respected values. And let us take Hungary with the internal democracy problem, and clearly this is not a European value. This is against European values. But I do think that if you take all the complex of the new Europe, of the enlargement, and we take account of the previous situation, we must say that the values of democracy have gained progress in spite of some failure, in spite of some, let's say, problem that we had. And as the Polish case demonstrated, democracy must be patient, insist on its values and make progress, make democratic progress. Because if we behave like many of contemporary democratic system, increasing difference, not respecting the real rights of many people. Clearly, we cannot complain that there are differences among European countries. We have the same type of difference inside the different European countries. We must not mix up. We must not have the idea that the differences are, let's say, typical of the European situation. Differences are inside the democratic systems. This is our problem. And this is the problem that worries me, Clearly, we generally give the responsibility to the difference among states, but many of these differences are built inside the European state. In the previous discussion, I listened that it was correct, French people and Dutch people, they were voting against the European Constitution. But when we look inside the vote, it was much more a consequence of national difference, not of difference with the European Constitution. That what I mean is that you need decades to have a common European spirit coming from centuries and centuries of fighting. But we have basic common values and we have to work on that.
Thank you. Truly appreciate it. Mr. Van Rompuy, I'm afraid you're muted. If you could turn on your microphone. We cannot hear you otherwise. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. There is somebody else asking, ¿cómo se podría evitar que...
How could we avoid Mr. Van Rompuy? We've got a question. How could we avoid Europe to become a political weapon in the future where the interests of politicians are defended instead of the interest of citizens? So how can we avoid politics to become a politician's weapon instead of a weapon that works in favor of citizens?
That question. It's a question in a sloganesque way, if you allow me to qualify the question. Why? Because it is suggesting that there is an opposition of a contradiction between the so-called political world and citizens. Two remarks. First of all, the citizen, the unique citizen, doesn't exist. We never had in our history so many opinions, so many feelings, such a diversity of political parties and so on. So the unique citizen is simply doesn't exist. You have different kinds of citizens, different kinds of opinions, different kinds of convictions. So, and it is already for a politician extremely difficult to know what the public opinion wants, because the public opinion is divided. We never had so many political parties. In the Netherlands, they have 20 political parties now represented in the parliament. There's not one party representing all the citizens. No, 20 are representing the citizens. So this is the first thing that you have to bear in mind, that we are living in very, very diverse societies, which makes governing those countries and governing Europe much more difficult. The second is that the political world as such is as a reflection of what is happening in society, is also very diverse and very fragmented, and is looking for a consensus, and it's becoming much more difficult in the past than today. It is much more difficult to govern a country now than 10 or 20 years ago. France has a minority government. Germany, the two biggest countries in the European Union, has now a coalition with three parties, which they never had, and they are quarreling all the time. Not because they like that quarreling, but they have different programs, but they have, at the same time, they are in the same government. So what my point is that you are living, and that was my point also in my introduction, we are living in a very complicated world, where societies are deeply divided, and as a reflection, the political world too. And so each time we have to make the best of it. Those who have responsibilities, they have to make the best of it. But at the same time, we have to work on stronger communities and stronger citizens. And that's my point, was that we live too much in an individualized society, in an individualized world. So we have to transform more individuals to persons via dialogue, via all kinds of new forms of cooperation. You know, rebuilding a society is a long-term objective. It's a bottom-up effort that has to be taken. And it all starts with dialogue. When in a dialogue you respect the others, you are listening to the others, and then the second stage is that you all cooperate to do things together. And that's what is called the common good, transcending your private interest and working towards the interest of all, at least of a majority of people. And that we have to rebuild in each of our countries. And European citizenship cannot exist if there is not a rebuilding of citizenship in each of our member states. And it all starts with dialogue. The opposite of dialogue is the shouting on social media. Because there is nobody is listening. Nobody is taking into account the opinion of others. And that's just the opposite of what we try to do. My last remark is about what's happening in Europe. I'm less pessimistic than most of all. I'm still surprised that with the weak member states we have, at a certain moment 2 years ago, there were 15 countries with minority governments. So with weak national governments, the last years we succeeded in making major unprecedented breakthroughs. It happened in the COVID period with this big program of relaunching of the European economy, more than almost 800 billion funded in a European way. We had then, even in recent times, this pact of migration and asylum is not perfect. But after 5 years, we succeeded in having an agreement with a mix of responsibility and solidarity. Am I enthusiastic about it? No. But I see that we can still find agreements on extremely difficult topics as migration and asylum. We reacted firmly until 2 months ago on the Russian aggression. We helped with a lot of solidarity our Ukrainian friends who are fighting for our values. Not only their values, but our values. Could we do more? Yes. And some countries are doing more than other countries, and some are more aware than other countries. But when I look to what we achieved, I said Europe still exists in a world that's also much more fragmented than in the past. and geopolitically even. And United States, China, European Union, we are all looking for our new place in this new world. And we, of course, Europe will not have the place of the colonial times. We are not an imperial Europe anymore. We have to look at our own interests and see where we can defend our values. And the first responsibility, as far as values is concerned, is to help to defend the Ukrainians. What in Ukraine is now going on is in some way a clash of civilizations, a clash between two kinds of societies. By the way, both claiming Christianity, the Russians and the Ukrainians. But take this aside. It is not a clash of religions, although both have religions, religion is at the background, but it's a clash of values. And there we take our responsibility. And Ukrainians have other sensitivities, yes, but they put them aside. They have to join the consensus. So let us look also about what we, although the situation is extremely difficult and delicate, what we achieved the last years. But I am much more worried about not the public values, but the private values, the values in our societies. And there we have to rebuild community, going from individuals to persons, which much more encouraging all kinds of dialogue and cooperation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Van Rompuy.
Of a common good, not only at the European level, but also at the national.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to say thank you very much, but we have to finish here. Perdón.
And I'm sorry for all of those of you who had questions. I'm so sorry for the 2 questions we had here. And I promise you that if you email us those questions, we will answer them. I'm so sorry, but we've run out of time. So we've come to the very end of the event. So thank you very much, Mr. Prodi, Mr. Van Rompuy, Vicky, Íñigo, Julio. At the end, I wish we could stay here longer. But that's not the case. So thank you very much to all of the organizers, and we conclude this roundtable. Thank you.
Mientras se... Muchas gracias.
While our panelists leave the stage, we have come to the very end of this long day. Of course, it's impossible to improvise conclusions. I would only like to mention a few of the words that were said, just out of the mere taste of remembering what was said today. We started with the presentation of Simona Negruzzo and Juan María Laboa on the great values or the great thought by Paul VI and its application not only on the EU, but its performative application in Spain. And I believe that marked really well the start of our day with a Pope that had a sense of history, had a sense for patience as well, and who was deeply committed, who took a stand, as Professor Laboa said. Mr. Calvo Sotelo talked about the subtle and evolutionary reality of political participation in the complex map of competence, of rights, of initiative. But I remember that quote he made that he urged Europeans to admire one another. That was interesting. Mr. Schlachtenweit, I've taken note of the title of a letter to bishops that it was Fresh Air for Europe. I believe it's really necessary. He was talking about coalitions and concessions and, in his opinion, the lack of opposition. That would be a topic we could debate. Mr. Muzzi as well, thank you very much for contributing with some very competent, very experienced reflections on the different parties and European families that we don't know well enough. Professor Pestaño, other than evoking the wealth of multilingualism that we have experienced today here, has also pointed our attention to something that is very interesting, which is the different experience if comparing the founding states and the ones that have entered the Union later on in terms of their conception of sovereignty, of those that actually give in or recover sovereignty. He taught us about how the values defended in the treaties are implemented and the institutional strength that their application has. Professor Beckman's, I've taken note two concepts that I think are very interesting. The concept of the cosmopolitan perspective of multi-level governance, I think that was a very interesting concept, and of the governance of global public goods, which is the topic of the seminar that we are holding here about the European response to changes when it comes to technology and the labor market. Professor Beckmans has reaffirmed the Christian aspiration and how current it is. He said that it's the fruit of willingness, and I believe that could be a conclusion, that Christian contributions, as long as they're competent and specific, can be effective. Out of the long reflection by Monsignor Crocetta, I've asked him for his text so that we can share it here about secularization and about Europe that is being built, an idea that Pope Paul VI had already mentioned. Well, this seems like a sort of like countercultural movement because it goes against certain trends in today's culture. So he's talked about the autonomy that politics have recovered, that science, economy have recovered. And he talked about some elective religion and of possible arbitrary decisions, without delving deep into all of this, because we should read his text and think about it. He talked about the danger of tempting alliances among populisms with religions, which is something that we are familiar with, I'm afraid. And he recommended us to overcome mutual distrust when it comes to the relationship between European institutions and churches. Professor Harlick left a question. Secularization won't be a prodigal son of the church. It's something that should lead us to reflect. Then Western Christianism has always been separate from the state, unlike other churches. Father Barrios talked about practical solidarity. He talked about the official dialogue of European institutions with churches. And he talked about the COMSI before the perspective of the EU enlargement, something that we have actually not sufficiently spoken about. We might need to devote a special session to that topic. Pastor Abad urges churches to efficiently disseminate the values of dialogue for a Europe with a heart. It's something that can be done, even though they have reduced influence, but it's something that can be done at their own respective levels. And then during this roundtable, we could witness the wisdom and incredible experience of former Presidents Van Rompuy and Romano Prodi. We've talked about community, people relating to one another. We've talked about close relationships. We talked about putting markets and states at the service of people, the fact that we're all European without being aware of that. And we talked about common good and common goods. All of these are wonderful topics that would require longer time to debate. Our excellent moderator had to cut the dialogue short, even though it was a very enriching dialogue, but well, we'll look for ways to delve deeper into those topics. Well, we will come up with a summary of conclusions that we will send to all of the people who had registered or who were present during this event. We will add to those conclusions the texts of our speakers, and those of them who haven't sent us their speeches, they will be able to do so tomorrow, even add corrections to their text if that's what they'd like to do, because I think it might be interesting to reread these documents. I believe that the main idea that in my mind emerges from this day is the idea of ongoing process, of a work in progress, an idea of a conversations that is the core itself of democracy. And we are fortunate enough to have that political space that is an ongoing political space that is based on coalitions, debates, concessions, something that is incredibly beneficial when we are experiencing moments of excessive polarization at national levels. However, we do live with these coalitions, but by finding our common grounds in some shared values that should be present in different policies and application tools or instruments. And as Pope Paul VI himself said, if I'm not wrong, we are in a situation in which it is important to live before we define. I believe that it's a quote by Pope Paul VI. I think this could be a sort of slogan in order to continue our work within the framework of this seminar. I believe that as long as we're capable of defining competent proposals with Christian inspiration, we'll be able to contribute to make sure this nation or this union building process continues in the right direction. And this was an effort in that direction. So thank you very much, everybody, once again. Thank you to the Paul VI Institute. Thank you to all participants. And we will continue, pursue with these reflections and to remember them once we need to cast our votes in the coming days. Thank you very much, everyone. Jesus? Some final words? Well, I would only like to thank you all and remind you of the fact that we'll have a little cocktail with Spanish wine, particularly for those of you who come from abroad, here in the outdoor area. Thank you very much, everyone, once again.